But as soon as all raw land was claimed, and that claim enforced by the power of the group, the individual became a pure fiction, the legendary hero of Western stories. Without a living example, a society of free men is difficult for man-like beings brought up on metropolitan concepts to imagine. But at long intervals in the history of the world, individuals have a brief opportunity to attempt to form a society of men, rather than a monstrous fourth stratum organism. We can make ourselves ready to grasp the next opportunity, which is as certain to come as tomorrow's dawn. Every metropolitan civilization has in its creation the inborn destiny of its destruction. It is made up of man-like creatures of two sexes and a man potential. Both these fifth and sixth strata qualities must be destroyed if civilization is to become a stable fourth stratum entity as it has in bee and ant colonies. So long as this retrogression is avoided, we will have the continual spectacle of one civilization after another flowering but to perish. This will not end until the product is not a nation, nor a civilization, nor a one-world organism of humanity, but a society of men sovereign, conscious God entities of the sixth discipline. The problem of creating a pagan society. We have perceived a single pattern running through our innate knowledge and our objective observations which gives us a fully satisfying explanation of the origin, existence, and purpose of the universe. Our ethical concept, and the culture that we would evolve to aid the purpose of the universe, are thereby given an unmistakable direction. The direction might be briefly indicated by the following statements: true man is, and must be, a sovereign individual. As such, no formal rules, either as dogma or law, can ethically be pressed upon him. Our culture should therefore aim at providing individual freedom both to perceive and to act. It should favor propagation of true man by effectively countering any group effort to impose its will on that of the individual. This concept is basic, so let us restate it from another perspective in order to further narrow the possibility of misunderstanding. When two or more man-like beings join together to enforce their will upon another, who has not, while having an adequate alternative, voluntarily contracted with them to prevent certain clearly specified acts of his, it can only be construed as an act of war against the individual. Then, if he be true man, his consideration is not one of ethics but one of strategy against an enemy who is trying to destroy him. True man cannot accept the dogma of an inherent ethical right that a group may exercise over an individual. That principle is paramount. We recognize many benefits which individuals have received from groups, even from those swelled to the proportions of metropolitan civilizations. Whether for ultimate good or bad, life within such a group is part of every individual's environmental heritage. As it doubtless was once with the sea when we first ventured onto the land, it may seem to some of us that there can be no life and nourishment apart from the total embrace and dominance of such a group. But for an air-breathing land animal, a complete re-swallowing by the sea is death. He may remember the sea with affection, return to swim in it, sail on it, but if it floods the highest mountain peak he has climbed and he has prepared no ark, he will drown. Such also is the relationship between the pagan and the metropolis, and, as of this moment, the metropolis is approaching all-enveloping flood proportions. For the individual being, the benefits of the now flooding metropolitan civilizations have little appeal when acceptance of them entails acceptance of the soul-destroying concepts and pressures of a dogma-fanaticized mob closing in on one from all sides and proclaiming by words and actions, "We are an entity. We must feel and act as an entity. He who does not feel and act with us must be destroyed." Such mobs, and our culturally conditioned inclination to accept their concepts and to join them, are the great problem which we face in creating a pagan society. As they press in upon us, the individuals who compose the mob are clearly perceivable as individuals, but when we turn to face them they do not face us as true men of integrity face others of their kind. Zombie-like, they disclaim responsibility for their own acts. Because their perceptions of entities have been perverted by metropolitan religions, they do not draw back from the concept of an entity that has no reality. They say that they are mere parts of some metropolitan pseudo-entity. Having been converted, they do not act in their own interests as they perceive them, they act according to the dogmatically stated interest of the unreal creation. They demand that we either join them or do battle with them over which unreal entity God, party, church, nation, etc. shall be upheld. We see nothing unethical in a mature, fully conscious man giving battle to another mature, fully conscious man who considers him his mortal enemy, but we can accomplish nothing by joining or doing battle with mobs of downy-cheeked, dogma-drugged youths who are simply fighting because they have been conditioned to visualize themselves as protecting or destroying purely hypothetical entities that are not realities. Individual human beings, animals, land, houses, and factories are realities, but a line drawn around them, or a common quality perceived in them, or a common shibboleth proclaimed by individuals within the line, does not make them into an entity. To conceive an entity that does not exist and try to create it may be an art objective, but to assert its existence because it has been conceived and given a name is madness. If we want to biologically and psychologically alter man to make a group of men into a real entity, although individuals are still physically segregated, as bees and ants have done, we can do it, but it is retrogression from the 6th to the 4th stratum of being. The highest entities which we can perceive from looking within ourselves and looking at others, the beings we perceive as true men, are captives by the millions in all nations. We can fight no nation without fighting our own kind of real entities who in order to survive have been required to talk and act as if they were part of some pseudo-entity for so many generations that they have lost all memory of their own unconverted beings. Therefore, the most essential thing for every pagan to remember amid the din of shouted dogmas is this: in the universe of reality no group of individuals can be perceived as an entity. We cannot fight what is not real. These unreal people entities, the contemplation of which reduces men to beings without perception or volition, can only be destroyed by being ignored and forgotten. We need a culturally impassable desert separating us and our children from the dogma-mouthing zombies, until we and our children relearn perception. Our children need to hear the words of the dogmas, but without the color of authority and the constant repetition which gives them their hypnotic effect. If they are heard simply as words, our children will be able to decide for themselves whether or not the words point to realities. That they may have something for comparison, we need to create a new language that points only to perceivable realities, and a new art that portrays only the dream desires for possible future realities that we seek to create in the depths of our beings. But there is no place for individuals to go and be free from the constantly repeated dogmas. In the name of their word-created entities, the states, the zombies claim every square inch of land on Earth. And pagans are beings who need daily contact with the natural environment that gave birth to man. We, therefore, need much more space per person than the herd animals who have been converted into zombies that draw their sole nourishment from the metropolitan world of words rather than from the more disciplined world of physically expressed selves in direct interaction with the world of physical reality. But, if there were adequate space now, we would not want to go until we had awakened those who can be restored to consciousness, and may be given the very weak enough nourishment so that they could stand on their own feet. Then let us face the realities presently before us. We have concluded that the whole man who lives a full life of action is the highest. We have been adopted from this highest life by losing ourselves in the great mass of self-styled peoples who are motivated by metropolitan religions. Trying to appeal to masses thus motivated is hopeless. The accumulation of religious and philosophical works which men worship is so great that half a lifetime is needed to know it well enough to judge it fairly. Because of this, the average man-like being limits the scope of his action to his day-to-day needs, which do not force upon him the necessity for considering the great mass of religious and philosophical word creations that he accepts on faith. The great number of man-like beings who accept, without examining, the extant word-perpetuated thought patterns constitutes a formidable mass of inertia. A man of action, whose scope of purpose would take him to the core of reality, would not only be required to spend half a lifetime learning his way around in the religions of the world, but he would also be required to face the problem of acting upon the inert mass of man-like beings who have not considered the problem, and yet are near enough to being true men to be reluctant to act without knowing. This state of things precludes leaders of depth and knowledge and followers of stature and balance from organizing in a course of action that could be effective in moving the inert mass. Life is not long enough. All mass action, then, is taken by 1. A more impulsive than conscious radical, leading an unstable mob against the inert mass, or 2. A shallow leader and his zombie followers who do not consider direction carefully but simply swim with and add momentum to the tide of affairs that is running. Thus a tide of major proportions in human affairs once set in motion must run its unbalanced course to its ultimate distortion and disaster, or meet an opposing tide in mass warfare. So long as men believe in and recreate peoples, in whom the individual is swallowed up, the individual has freedom of action only in the short periods of chaos that follow catastrophe. While freedom is restricted to the use of words, our objective is to repeatedly call the attention of such men as are capable of perception to the fallacy of their worshipful submission to the tyranny of the group, and to prepare for action in the chaos that follows the next catastrophe. This momentary relief of physical pressure seems to be just a lull before a great worldwide catastrophe, an atomic war between two or more pseudo-entities of word-created peoples, communists, socialists, democrats, humanitarians, or whatever the zombies who mouth the declarations that they are pieces of some word creation call themselves. We have little doubt that their war will clear ample space for us if any of us chance to be left. But even if someday we should be faced with a necessity for clearing living room, we would need to take the same initial steps in preparing ourselves to make the most of it. So let us simply take those initial steps now, while waiting for possible future circumstances to narrow down to a present reality that we are prepared to meet. Our first step is to determine how many of us are now conscious enough and have strength enough to stand up and be counted. Our next step is to awaken those of us who are semi-conscious. This can be done by books, lectures, articles, drama, television, movies, and other works of art. Scatter fire to stir consciousness in any pagan with a remaining glimmer of perception. But there are all stages of semi-consciousness, and we need to select by personal perception those who we believe can be nourished back to health. For discovering the extent to which each individual is controlled by dogma-conditioned reflexes, progressively selective discussion groups can be useful. These might begin with public discussions of selected books, progress through more selective discussions of ideas, continue on to discussion of direction, and finally to discussion and coordination of strategy by pagans. Creation of bases for nourishment and operation is our next step. These would be similar to the early monasteries of the Catholic Church in that they would be camps in areas of alien culture, but they would be radically different in function. Institutional religions attempt to bury their concepts in a people's consciousness and claim that they are inborn in the conscience of the individual. The deeper they are buried, the better the purpose of the institution is served, for they become much harder for the individual to perceive as something acquired rather than innate. The pagan objective, and indeed the object of all personal religions, is to free the self from the influence of all acquired knowledge, discover what actually is innate knowledge, and bring it forth into waking consciousness. Thus our camps would not be centers for insinuating pagan ideals into the surrounding peoples, but centers where pagans and pagan children could find a perceptive life out of earshot of shouted dogmas and shibboleths. The selection of sites would be affected by this difference in function. The sites should be located away from metropolitan centers. This would serve several purposes. It would give the necessary desert between pagans and dogma-mouthing zombies. It would tend to increase the proportion of pagans left in the world in event of a catastrophic atomic war. It would serve as a base of operation in the chaos following such a war. It would serve the purpose of helping to break the umbilical cord with the metropolis. And it would serve as a university for relearning the realities of being. To accomplish some of these purposes, our bases of operation should aim at being largely self-contained and self-supporting without commerce. To disdain any products or processes in initial camp establishments would be a stupid faddishness, but the camps should be able to survive alone in their long-range function. For long-range function they should produce all their own food and necessities of existence. This self-sufficiency would also aid the centers in serving as universities in the realities of existence, even while still only camps of pagans in the midst of peoples. Each camp should have as close an intimacy with woods, mountains, rivers, ocean, wildlife, etc. as possible, so as to teach perception of the realities on which man's being rests. Modern man's concern with conquering his environment is a fear complex. He has lost his knowledge of how to win his livelihood in a wild world as the world's most intelligent animal. He forgets that the problem was solved long ago. Because he, himself, is not thoroughly conversant with it, he wants the science of the metropolis to protect him from the vast, terrifying unknown. In true man there is no place for this fear complex, and we must see that it is not formed in our children. Obviating this by teaching survival in the wilds should be a function of the center. Insofar as permitted by the laws of the captors in whose midst the center was established, each center should be a rehearsal for a pagan society, so that we might relearn, not as theory but as reality, the pattern of living among individuals as sovereign entities. A continuing council of strategic cooperation should also be established, because a council among sovereign individuals needs even more rehearsal to become a reality than the acts of individuals simply living as individuals. We have been in too many councils among men conditioned by metropolitan religions not to know the dogmas contained in remembered situation words as well as the dogmas contained in word utterances. In every council among men who remember a metropolitan assembly there lurks the unspoken dogma: we who meet here together are one people. Therefore, a great danger is that, in attempting to coordinate strategy, we may begin to fancy that we, who coordinate our individual efforts, comprise a group that is an entity. Let us set forth among ourselves some of the points on which to focus our perception if we are to avoid this. The greatest danger we face in our councils is that the frustrated impulses of the male, which the metropolis has damned to give motivating power to its dogmatic purposes, will push us into precipitate action. A society of fully conscious pagans could restrain each other's frustrated male impulses, but, while we are captives, prohibited by the laws of our captors from disciplining each other, and while some of us are still drugged, we must be doubly careful to listen to no demagogue in our midst and see that no mob rises up among the still drugged whom we have taken among us in an attempt to restore them to consciousness. While we are seeking only to awaken drugged pagans, we may not expect that to be difficult, but it may be. We may become overambitious and try to save those who are drugged beyond hope of recovery. If we do this, we may defeat our whole objective. 10 conscious pagans are more effective than 10,000 who are only semi-conscious. We are not interested in making converts to our religion or our way of life, but in living it. Yet when we voice our criterion of being, the freedom and dignity of the individual, we find ourselves in strange company. We find that we have uttered the cry of demagogues the world over. More men have been led into slavery by the war cry of liberty than any other. And on all sides we see masses of zombies proclaiming that they are individuals because they conform completely to the latest fad of how an individual should think and act. They do not want to be individuals, they want to be the leaders of a new fad. Paganism could become such a fad, and this must be avoided. We must find a way of keeping a distance between ourselves and demagogues crying individuality who would join us, or have us join them, because they claim that they too are individuals. We want to form a society of individuals to protect ourselves and our children from the pressures of the dogma-shouting mobs, but is that not substantially what has been said by all who have ever joined together against the mob in power and, to give weight to their words, have mutually pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor? We hear advocates of democracy say that the best government is the least government. We hear the Christian Bible say that religion, pure and undefiled, is to help the widows and orphans and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. These sound like proper words, spoken by true individuals, but when we look at the spectacle of democracy and Christianity, we frequently do not see individuals but mobs of dogma-mouthing zombies. What is the difference between a society of individuals and a dogma-shouting mob, if, as we have seen, individuality can become a war cry of a mob like any other shibboleth if it strikes a harmonic chord in the word-perpetuated accretion of religious concepts? What distinguishes an individual from a verbally controlled zombie that is effectively merely part of a mob? We do not, by definition, want to make the word individual synonymous with the word pagan. Pagan implies an individual, but it also signifies a certain development of consciousness and perception. Individual signifies only integrity of being and faithfulness to the impulses of one's being as opposed to control by dogma acting on conditioned reflexes. All wild animals are individuals, even the herd animals. In man-like creatures, the designation individual does not necessarily imply that one perceives the universe as we pagans perceive it. It signifies only a full recognition that an individual's criterion of behavior must be found within himself. That perception must be sufficiently integrated into his being so as to make it, not merely a theory, but the actual basis on which he would found all social behavior. Bizarreness does not make an individual, neither bizarreness of appearance nor bizarreness of beliefs and ideas and actions. 10,000 men marching in highly disciplined columns, uniform to the point of indistinguishability, and even, if possible, uniform in every cell of their bodies and every thought and emotion of their beings, could be individuals. The thing that makes them individuals is that the controlling impulses come from the integrated depths of their beings, that their controlling impulses do not come from dogmas superficially imposed upon them. They cannot be individuals in theory only and deny individual sovereignty in action. Those who perceive that the individual should be free and proclaim it in theory often deny individual sovereignty in action because, in their short-sighted perspective, it does not appear practical and efficacious. Jefferson inclined to the belief that full individual freedom is best but said that such a state would not support sufficient population to effectively combat the mobs made possible by a partial sacrifice of individual freedom. He chose compromise to gain greater effectiveness. We now see the results of that compromise. We recognize that what is not efficacious has no ultimate value, but history has shown that the spectacular appearance of effectiveness which a mob exhibits is like the streak of a meteor soon burned out. There is no long-range effectiveness in the group except as a cultural pressure affecting the evolutionary stream of man. While civilizations rise and fall, it is the individual, the being who is perceivable as a flesh and blood entity, that is finally effective. Out of the group that has existence only as a verbal entity, the individual entity repeatedly emerges as the triumphant reality. So let us not limit individual sovereignty with a hope of gaining greater effectiveness unless we can see that the desired effect will become part of the evolutionary stream of man. The history that the metropolitan civilizations have tried so hard to destroy or pervert, that of the northern European pagans, reveals another, a very subtle, danger point that we need to avoid in considering strategy. The northern European pagans stood strong against every expedient and ignoble mob-producing practice, but they finally were destroyed by the dogma that a true soldier is a higher being than a true man. This resulted from something more than simple expression of egoism by trying to excel in nobility and bravery through the voluntary sacrifice of what they held even dearer than life, individual sovereignty. In creating their concept of a soldier, the leaders, who would not be outdone by their followers, and the followers, who considered it a disgrace to walk away from a battle where their leaders died, were voicing their noblest love song to the true pagan woman who loved well and was eternally faithful. The song still rises in man's being and causes us to pay homage, with tears in our eyes, unfortunately, not only to the woman marching by the beaten man, but also to the faithful fool that follows the torn flag. With incessant repetition, the deliberate act of the soldier voluntarily sacrificing his sovereignty as well as risking his life that first began as a pagan love song to true woman became at last a mere dogma of behavior. That is a dogma that, as God entities who are sprung from these heroes, we feel a great emotional reluctance to denounce. Yet denounce it we must, not only as a dogma but as a love song. The true man who would fight the good fight must choose his enemy with a perception that his oath as a soldier makes impossible for him. If we must find a way to voice our love song to woman's faithfulness with a gesture that seems fitting to us before woman who undergoes the pain of death in each childbirth, we should find a way to do it without becoming less than men. The fourth discipline has its place in our lives, but as true men it is our task to find a place for it that adds to, rather than undermines, the later disciplines. So long as herds of dogma-mouthing zombies continue to exist, we cannot denounce mass warfare completely, but we can recognize it for what it is, an expedient in which we become less than men. If we choose this expedient and tentatively become soldiers by oath rather than simply warriors by temperament, we should make our oaths of limited duration and for a limited, clearly conceived and clearly stated objective. It is axiomatic that we could have a disciplined army only of volunteers, but even so, we should be careful to avoid, by words or actions, committing our comrades or our children to a holy war. Mass warfare waged by zombies and mass warfare waged by true men is objectively indistinguishable. In mass warfare, we abdicate our role as perceivable, conscious God entities. The objective indistinguishability during mass warfare of a fourth discipline mob of zombies, a pack of fifth discipline animals, and a group of true men is one of the greatest dangers that mass warfare holds for us. This makes it impossible for us to distinguish our kind. In emergency fights for survival, of the sort that we might expect to follow the impending catastrophic atomic war, we might find ourselves with strange comrades in arms with whom we have made no deliberated alliance. Fights for survival are common to man, to all man-like creatures, and to all organic life. A true man may properly risk his life and die for his horse or dog. Also he may do the same for any man-like creature. What the individual perceives and wills must be for him his criterion of action. The danger lies in failing to distinguish between fighting for a flesh and blood entity and becoming committed to the cause of a conceptual entity that has no reality. Metropolitan man-like creatures, unlike horses and dogs, insinuate the causes of their word gods and the concepts of their unreal entities into the semi-consciousness of their comrades merely because they have learned to mouth them in times of stress, in times of rest, at all times, including the times when their comrades are too weary or too engrossed for conscious perception of the danger. If they have the appearance of men and have fought bravely and well, under conditions where men, animals, and zombies are indistinguishable by their actions, we are likely to call them brothers. Then, before we discover that they cannot eat and digest the food of men, we are likely to seal our brotherhood by partaking with them their proffered drug of dogma, and instead of making them our allies as men, join with them as one people in fighting some creation of words which they call enemy. Then, no matter whether we win or lose the battle, we will awaken one morning to find that we have become slaves. We face no danger of becoming slaves to men who have perceivable purpose and volition as men. It is not in dealing with men as men that the slavery danger lies. The danger lies in dealing with peoples or states rather than real entities. In meeting this danger, we should remember the lesson of history. Slavery for men of our stature begins, not as slavery, but as noblesse oblige. We must, therefore, assume no obligation to protect, cherish, or save harmless any man-like creatures who are less than man and less than animal, creatures who evidence that they are mere zombie-like pieces of a people or state. If we assume such an obligation, we will discover too late, discover only after we have forged our own bonds that we have sacrificed individual sovereignty and have become slaves to an unreal entity that exists only as a creation of words. If we would avoid becoming slaves to a god of words, we must be on the alert against becoming kings by the grace of such a god. The knowledge that becoming kings is only a road to becoming slaves may be a needed deterrent while we have regained only semi-consciousness. When we are fully awakened, we see the desire to travel the road itself as being ignoble, for becoming kings provides us with less than the fullest expression of our beings. To be emperor of all the peoples of the world is to be less than a pagan. End.